placement for you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and our good friends from C-SPAN to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Today's Noon Author Talk is being presented in conjunction with our current exhibit, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History. Since the first European settlers, Americans have enjoyed a drink. At times, many of us have enjoyed a lot of drinks. But other Americans, fearing the harm alcohol would do to society and to individuals, have tried to stop our drinking or limit who, when, and where we could consume alcohol. These two different views of alcoholic beverages run throughout American history. Sometimes they have existed in relative peace. Other times they have been at war. Spirited Republic uses National Archives documents and artifacts to show how government programs and policies have changed over time and to illustrate the wide variety of views about alcohol held by Americans. The stories they tell echo today's debate over regulating drinking and the legalization of other drugs. The exhibit will be open until January 10th, 2016, and is located in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery on the main exhibit level. Over the next 4 months or so, the National Archives will continue to present Spirited Republic author talks, panel discussions, films, and wine and whiskey tastings, which have been very popular. To find out more about these upcoming programs and the exhibit, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you will find in the theater lobby, or you can visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is The Year of Fear, Machine Gun Kelly and the Manhunt That Changed the Nation by Joe Urschel. Joe Urschel is Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington, D.C. He's an award-winning journalist and television documentary producer with 25 years' experience in the news business. He was part of the editing team that conceived and launched USA Today in 1982 and held a variety of positions at the paper, including senior correspondent, managing editor, and op-ed columnist, where he covered a variety of political and social issues. He served as supervising producer of the paper's syndicated television production, USA Today on TV. Urschel led the team of historians, journalists, and producers that conceived, designed, and created the Newseum, the Museum of News Events and History, located on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., and served as its executive director from 1996 to 2011. Urschel is the former chairman of the George Foster Peabody Awards, the nation's oldest award program for electronic media, and currently serves as a member of the National Advisory Board of the College of Media at the University of Illinois, his alma mater. His journalism honors include awards from the National Association of Newspaper Columnists and the National Association of Sunday and Feature Editors. He won an Emmy Award for a news documentary on campus crime that he wrote and co-produced. Please join me in welcoming Joe Urschel to the National Archives.
Thank you, Doug. I must say I'm disappointed, though, that there's no wine and whiskey for this event. Had I known, I would have brought my own. Well, thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate you stopping by. I will try to refrain myself from droning on and on for too long so that I reserve some time for questions if you have any. So I think we have about 45 minutes time. About 30 minutes into this, if you're feeling like you really have a question you'd like to ask, you can just flag me and I'll start that part of the program. I first would like to explain a little bit how I got into this story and this book. As Doug said, I came here in 1982 for the launch of USA Today, and very excited to be in Washington. I was taking in all the tourist sites, of course, including the Library of Congress and its beautiful, stately reading room. And this is 1982, and the Library of Congress had just converted its card cataloging system over to a digital database, which patrons could use when they were visiting. So kind of on a lark, I went over to the computer keyboard and typed in my last name, which is fairly uncommon, or at least it was uncommon until the Baltimore Ravens drafted John Urschel, who is not only now more famous than me, but also a lot smarter. If you don't know anything about him, he's probably the only person in the NFL who's working on his PhD while he's playing. He's a mathematician. But anyway, when I put in my name, there was one entry that popped up. Keep in mind, this is the Library of Congress, the world's greatest collection of knowledge. And the entry was Charles Urschel, kidnapping victim. And there was one book written about it, and it was called Crime's Paradise, The Authentic Inside Story of the Urschel Kidnapping. So intrigued, I, of course, called it up and sat down and read it cover to cover. And it was the most remarkable story. I mean, it read like a Dashiell Hammett novel. I mean, it had more twists and turns in it than you could possibly imagine. And I was just flabbergasted because I had never heard of this guy. And basically, I hadn't heard of any Urschels in the country, really, other than the ones I was related to, most of whom lived in Albany, New York. So after I read the book, I called up my dad and I said, I just read this incredible book about Charles Urschel, this oil millionaire in Texas who got kidnapped in the 1930s. Are we related to him? And without a second thought, he said, no, we're not. I said, well, how do you know? He goes, just we're not. So like any good son, I immediately set out to prove my father wrong. And embarked on some genealogical research and was looking all over the country for Urschels. And I probably shouldn't admit this at the archives, but I never did find a connection. There was no connection really that I could find within the United States. If there is any connection, it dates back centuries to Saxony, which is now Germany. So with that, I decided, well, it's still a good story, and I just began collecting string on it over the last 30 years or so. And the more I learned about it, the better the story got. It's an incredible story about one of the most remarkable kidnappings in American history. It produced the largest manhunt in the nation up until that time. The manhunt covered 16 states, 20,000 miles. It resulted in a sensational trial that was covered daily by the press from around the world and recorded on motion picture cameras and shown in movie theaters week after week. Part of the sensational nature of that coverage resulted in federal trials banning cameras for the next probably 50 years. And even now, they're only used on an experimental basis. It launched the FBI and gave its agents their nickname G-Men. It resulted in the establishment of Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary, as a home for criminals who were deemed vicious and irredeemable, the worst of the worst. It sped the passage of the Federal Crime Bill of 1934, which made kidnapping a federal crime punishable by death and greatly expanded the powers of the FBI. All of this was made possible by the remarkable cooperation of Charles Urschel, kidnap victim. The story takes place in 1933, which is what I've deemed the year of fear, primarily because the year contains this incredible confluence of events that are taking place. In 1933, we're 3 years into the Great Depression. It's probably the worst year, the worst economic consequences are being played out across the nation as the economy sinks further and further. In the years since the 1929 crash, the market had lost almost 90% of its value. The unemployment rate for non-farm workers was up to 40%. In some cities, it stretched as high as 80%. Thousands of banks were closed. The loss of tax revenues necessitated draconian cuts in the social services, the few social services that did exist. Municipal workers, police, and teachers were laid off or went unpaid. Thousands of schools closed. Millions of students just dropped out. At the same time, catastrophic dust storms were beginning to kick up across the Southwest and the Midwest, later to become what we refer to now as the Dust Bowl. And these were incredible storms that would start in New Mexico or Oklahoma or Texas. And they'd blow so hard and so strong with so much fine silt that the people who lived in that area would have to do things like drape their child's beds and carriages with wet sheets just to prevent the silt from coming in and choking them to death. It would kill livestock in the fields. It would blow so far that it would turn the snow red in New England. Ships at sea who were coming into New York Harbor would encounter it, unable to see the skyline. You can see some of the effects of what these storms would do on local farms. And while the dust storms were kicking up and the economy was tanking, a sense of lawlessness was beginning to abound throughout the country. Machine gunners had just assassinated 4 law enforcement officers in broad daylight in the parking lot of Kansas City's Union Station, and violent gangs of bank robbers and thieves were operating with virtual impunity along what they called the criminal corridor, which stretched from Dallas, Texas to St. Paul, Minnesota. Anton Cermak was assassinated. Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, was standing next to FDR at a political event when he was assassinated in Miami. We now think that the assassination attempt was directed at FDR, but at the time, FDR thought the assassination attempt was successful and that Cermak was indeed the victim. Because Cermak had just unseated Fred Thompson, the mayor of Chicago. Thompson had formed kind of an unholy alliance with Al Capone and his criminal empire in Chicago. Cermak came in on a vow to rid the city of Capone, and the way he was going to do that was to ally himself with another gang known as the Terrible Tuohys, who were operating on the north side of the city. And he literally had hired some of Tuohy's men to be his police officers and bodyguards, and they had made an assassination attempt just weeks earlier on Frank Nitti, who was Capone's chief lieutenant. So while this is all going on, Prohibition is about to end. And the elimination of prohibition eliminates one of the criminal empire's most lucrative sources of money. So with the banks drying up, the bank robbing business isn't as good as it used to be. And with prohibition coming to an end, they're looking for other ways to make money. What happens in the 3 years since the market failure is an incredible spate of kidnappings begin occurring across the country. An estimated 2,000 kidnappings had occurred between 1930 and 1933. Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case being probably the most famous. So with no money left in the banks and their sideline business of running liquor drying up, the folks operating out west were looking for new ways to make money, and kidnapping wealthy individuals seemed to be a good way to do it. And the way that these operations would work is they would snatch a wealthy individual, hide him out across the state or county line where state police, county sheriffs could not chase them. They lose their authority once they leave their municipality. And so it was relatively easy to hide out somebody in a remote farm across the state line, ransom them for a certain amount of money, and then release them with the caveat that everything would be fine unless they go to the authorities. If they do go to the authorities, the threat was that we'll return and kill you, not only you, but all the members of your family as well. So the kidnapping scourge was working pretty well up until 1933 and Charles Urschel. People in Hollywood were driving around in armor-plated limousines with armed guards in the passenger seat. Companies were issuing kidnapping insurance. And while all this is going on, of course, FDR takes office and announces that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, when at the very same time, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor in Germany. So these are tough times in the US, with tougher times coming. So in the midst of this incredible scenario, George Kelly and his glamorous wife decide that they are going to kidnap the richest oil man in the Southwest. And with an almost remarkable lack of planning, Kelly and his partner Albert Bates burst into the Urschel home at 11:30 one hot July evening when Urschel and his wife are playing bridge with their friends, Walter Jarrett and his wife. So Kelly, armed with a machine gun, and Bates, armed with a .45, kick in the door, run up to the bridge game, and suddenly discover that they don't know which of the two guys is Urschel. So making all kinds of threats, they demand that Urschel reveal himself, which he doesn't do. He just sits there, and so does Walter. So as Kelly and Bates are getting increasingly belligerent, Walter decides that he's going to stand up and be a hero. So he begins to stand up, at which point Urschel begins to stand up too. And so Kelly says, okay, forget it, we'll take both of you. They put him in the car and they speed off into the night. A couple miles out of town, they realized that they could probably identify which one was Urschel by emptying their wallets. So they stop the car, they get the wallets, they take all of Jarrett's money, they give him $10 to get a cab back to town, and they take off with Urschel. They take him out to a farm owned by, in Wise County, Texas, just outside of Dallas. The farm is owned by Catherine Kelly's father-in-law, a guy known around town as Boss. It's sort of a sad, broken-down farm with a few animals where Boss lives with his wife and his son and his son's wife. So they stick Urschel in, they blindfold him. He's been blindfolded for the entire ride. They cover his ears with cotton and tape them shut. And for the next 8 days, he is basically blind and deaf and chained to a high chair, actually, or a bed frame at various times of the day. But nevertheless, he's the kind of guy who does not part with his money very willingly. And he's bound and determined that if he ever gets out, he's going to come back and find these guys and get his money back. So he begins collecting information about where he is. He knows how long the car ride took, but he also realizes that they were going in a circuitous route designed to confuse him. But this is a guy who's been working his whole career for a fellow named Tom Slick, who is known as the King of the Wildcatters. So he and Urschel have been finding oil all over Oklahoma and Texas, and they know just about every inch of that territory, backward and forward. So Urschel, who grew up on a farm in the Midwest, realizes, of course, that he's on a farm. He begins counting the number of different animals, finds out how many there are, how many milking cows there are, all kinds of information on the farm itself. He walks the room he's held in. At various times, he collects information from the people who are holding him about what other buildings are around, how big the farm is, what the postman's name is, who the local prostitute is. And while he's doing all this, over the course of 8 days, he realizes that at 9:30 in the morning and at 5:30 at night, a plane is passing overhead. So he puts all that in the data bank while he's leaving his fingerprints all over anywhere he possibly can. In the meantime, his wife has collected the money for the ransom and has paid it off. And so at the point they're about to release Urschel, Catherine Kelly, who is really the tougher of the two characters, insists that they got to kill him. And George, of course, is saying, no, I mean, we can't kill him. If we kill him, they're going to come after us with the U.S. Marines. We'll never get away. And plus, we won't be able to kidnap anybody else because our threats will be empty. And their plan was to kidnap 5 more people, ransom them at $200,000 each, which is about 8 to 10 million in contemporary dollars, and retire as millionaires in Juarez, Mexico. Everybody's got their dreams, right? So that plan is eventually thwarted, and they do release Urschel, who returns to his home in Oklahoma City, which by then, of course, is surrounded by hordes of press from around the world, and motion picture cameras from newsreel photographers, and various members of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover's group, as well as some local police. Urschel comes in and immediately is debriefed by an FBI agent known as Gus Jones, who just listens to this data dump, and having started out telling him that finding these kidnappers would be like finding a needle in a haystack, after 90 minutes of talking to Charles, he said, well, we just got a really small haystack. So consequently, Urschel borrows a plane from one of his oil friends. They go up in the air. They fly the route that the airline that they've identified had flown. They look down using Urschel's sketch of what he thinks the farm looks like. They identify a farm that looks exactly like the drawing. They put together a raiding party. Urschel insists that he be in the lead car, the raiding party, with a sawed-off shotgun on his lap. And in the middle of the night, they burst in, or early in the morning, they burst in, and they arrest the Shannons and a fellow named Harvey Bailey, who was staying at the farm, kind of hiding out after his escape from state prison in Kansas. Harvey Bailey is an incredible character in this book that I'm just so fortunate happened to stumble into this story because it gives me all kinds of great side stories to tell. Harvey Bailey was considered the most successful bank robber in American history. He was a guy who basically invented the modern form of bank robbing, which involves a lot of careful planning, determining what the best escape routes are, riding the escape routes, having multiple backup plans, figuring out when there's the most money in the bank to be robbed by studying the local economy and the county tax records, what the police activity is like, how far away the police station is, what kind of cars the police have, if they have any. And basically, if Harvey was planning your bank robbery, it was going to go well, and nobody was going to know who did it. And part of his MO was the fact that he would never, ever admit to having robbed a bank or try to take credit for anything. As a result, he successfully robbed the Denver Mint. He robbed the Lincoln National Bank of so much money that the bank failed the next day. He did so well in the 20s that by the late 20s, he retired from the bank robbing business and opened a series of gas stations and car washes in Chicago, but lost all his money in the market crash and had to go back to the business that he knew so well. So he had worked with George Kelly on a number of bank jobs, and in fact had lent George $1,000 when George was low on funds. So after he heard about the kidnapping, he went down to the farm in Wise County to collect the money that George owed him and to nurse a wound that he sustained when he was escaping from prison. He just happens to be sleeping in the backyard on a cot when Gus Jones and Urschel arrived with their squadron of law enforcement. So even though George and Catherine had already fled the scene along with Albert Bates, they'd gone up to St. Paul to launder their money. The FBI agents still score an important victory here by pulling in Harvey Bailey, who's not only a bank robber, but he's an escaped prisoner. So the raid is considered a huge success, and it arrives just in time for J. Edgar Hoover, who in 1933 was not yet director of the FBI. In fact, he was barely holding on to his job. He had been, the Bureau of Investigation, as it was called then, had been given the job of solving the Lindbergh kidnapping. And they had done a fairly miserable job, and they had made almost no progress in the 18 months since it happened. When FDR took office, his first choice for Attorney General was a guy named Thomas Walsh, senator from Wyoming. Walsh had a long and bad history with J. Edgar Hoover. During the Harding administration, Hoover and the Bureau had been instructed to besmirch both Walsh and his fellow Senator Wheeler, both from Wyoming. These two were trying to launch an investigation of the Harding administration and uncover some of the scandals that later evolved. But J. Edgar Hoover's job was to, he tapped his phone and he read his mail and he tried to entrap him in a hotel room with a woman to get incriminating evidence on him, none of which succeeded, but it did succeed in making a lifelong enemy of Mr. Walsh, who was announced by FDR as his first choice for Attorney General. And after that announcement, Walsh vowed to get rid of that miserable son of a bitch, J. Edgar Hoover, as soon as he got to town. Now, unfortunately, Walsh was 72 years old, and before he got to town, he went down to Miami and married a Cuban debutante. And on the train ride back to Washington, when the train stopped in North Carolina, Walsh's wife woke up, but he did not. And subsequently, the next Attorney General was a guy named Homer Cummings, who was one of FDR's brain trust, who was originally slated to be ambassador to the Philippines, but Cummings takes over the Justice Department, and he's one of FDR's real go-getters, and he figures the way that he can raise the profile of the Justice Department, which was held in fairly low repute at the time, was referred to as the Department of Easy Virtue. He decides that he's going to ship this place up and go and prosecute a war on crime. You know, FDR was prosecuting a war on this, a war on that, a war on everything, and he really liked the militaristic sound of that, and he wanted to use the FBI to break up basically this criminal alley and anything else he could do. So J. Edgar is under a lot of pressure at this time to bring in some big score, and it looks like the Machine Gun Kelly case could be the one. There's Charles, the other leading character in the story. Charles, as I said, was a farm kid, grew up, enlisted in the Army during the First World War, and when he got out, was bound and determined that the last thing he was going to do any more of was farming. It was just too hard work, and didn't really pay off as well as he was hoping, so he strikes out for Oklahoma and decides to try to make his fortune in the oil business. He's got a real head for numbers. He's got a great memory, as you well know. And he hooks up with Tom Slick, the aptly named Tom Slick, who rapidly becomes the king of the Wildcatters, and they make their fortunes together. Unfortunately, right at the peak of their oil business, Tom Slick, at age 47, kind of your classic type A behavior guy, has a massive heart attack and dies. Charles then marries his widow, forming the Urschel Slick Oil Company, which is even bigger than the Tom Slick Company. And of course, that generates a lot of headlines in the paper about how rich these folks are and what their oil holdings entail. All of this was the interesting reading that got Catherine Kelly thinking about kidnapping Charles Urschel. Urschel and Slick, who had no great love for the press before the kidnapping, because they were always talking about their business affairs and their oil finds, suddenly has even more reason to despise them. So Charles goes into an alliance with J. Edgar Hoover. There's the home where the kidnapping occurs. And Hoover then prosecutes a nationwide search for Catherine and George. The FBI had just been given the sole responsibility for chasing kidnappers across state lines. And so they were really the only organization that could bring this to fruition. But there were two problems that they still had. One was the fact that they were not an armed police force. They were not trained in weapons. Most of them were lawyers and accountants who would help local municipalities prosecute criminal investigations. So Hoover looked around his agencies across the country to try to find people who would be skilled enough to go up against machine gunners and shotgun wielders, bank robbers, murderers, and whatnot. And he discovers that he's got fewer than 12 out of a force of 336. So he puts those guys together and puts this investigation in order, and it's run by Gus Jones, who had worked in Texas, kind of a legendary lawman. And this is a document produced by the by the Bureau after the successful prosecution of the case, which they used to further demonstrate their need for expanded powers. You can see all of the cities where they suspected the Kellys might be and where they had tracked them, And in fact, they had been in most of those places other than the ones on the West Coast. One of the things they did was try to close the borders because they thought they'd be leaving one way or another. Not a bad assumption. This is another document produced by the FBI, which just sort of mapped out the most prominent members of society who had been kidnapped. This is the famous Melvin Purvis, the special agent in charge of the Chicago office. Purvis is the agent who captured and killed John Dillinger, bringing great fame to the Bureau. However, on the Urschel case, he let Kelly slip through his fingers in Chicago. The FBI had discovered that Kelly was using a place called the Michigan Tavern as his sort of postal address and a place where he would go and hang out and would enjoy special protection from the local police. And he assigned Purvis to stake out the Michigan Tavern and try to snatch him. But literally, Purvis just forgot to do it. And by the time he remembered he was supposed to do it, he sent 2 agents, but they never went inside. And on that very day, Kelly was inside arranging to get a new automobile to escape to Memphis, Tennessee. And this did not make the director happy, and you may be aware that Melvin Purvis left the agency, a few years after all of these great events were occurring. So ultimately, they chase, after about 6 to 7 weeks on the road, they find Kelly in Memphis, Tennessee, and successfully arrest him. There he is walking out of the courthouse in chains, guarded by machine gunners. The FBI has now acquired quite an arsenal, and they deployed them very prominently during the trial and afterward. The interesting thing about Memphis is that Kelly started out in Memphis, Tennessee. He was the child of upper middle class parents. He was a caddy at the local country club. He's a pretty smart kid, but he did not enjoy a very good relationship with his father, whom he hated. And when he caught his father in a tryst with another woman, he basically blackmailed him and said, "I won't tell Mom about this." This is when he's in high school. "If you give me the family car and increase my allowance by X amount of money," which Kelly then used his new transportation and his money to hop across the border to Arkansas, which was a wet state. Tennessee was dry, and that's when he started his liquor running business as a young entrepreneur in high school. And things basically went downhill from there. Here is Catherine and George in federal court. They look a little bloated from 7 weeks on the road when they were going through about 3 or 4 gin bottles a day. And Kelly has already been pistol whipped by the FBI right in the courtroom in view of all of the spectators when he attempted to defend Catherine from what he thought was an advance by an FBI agent. You can maybe see the knot on his forehead there from one of the wounds he sustained. And this is Alcatraz, where he ended up. Homer Cummings and J. Edgar Hoover had a special contempt for the federal prison system, which they thought was too fluid, too easy to escape from, too corrupted, too coddling of prisoners, whatever. And so they wanted to create a prison that nobody could escape from, that only the worst of the worst would be sent to, and there would be no attempt at rehabilitation. It would be solely for confinement. They would be cut off from the outside world. They wouldn't be allowed to talk to one another. It was just a new special kind of hell for these 103 prisoners that they deemed to be the worst in the nation. People like Al Capone, various Midwestern murderers and thieves. So George Kelly ends up in the introductory class going to Alcatraz prison, where he lives out most of the rest of his life. Catherine Kelly was sent to a women's prison. She managed to get out in the late 50s. Harvey Bailey ends up with George on Alcatraz. He's later released into a state prison. And Charles, by that point, had sort of softened on the whole affair, and he went to FDR and Hoover and said, "Look, Harvey Bailey had nothing to do with this kidnapping. You know, we ought to let him out." So he agrees to probation for Harvey and sets him up as in Joplin, Missouri, with a job as a cabinet maker, and gets him a room at the YMCA where he lived out the rest of his life without committing another crime. The Urschels end up intact, though fairly rattled. They spent the rest of their lives as running their oil business. They set up a number of foundations, a biochemical research foundation in Texas, which is quite famous. But they didn't really feel all that comfortable in Texas in the Wild West anymore, and spent a lot of time traveling through Europe collecting art, and lived happily ever after. But part of what Charles experienced made him detest publicity of any kind. And so he instructed the rest of his family and anybody that would listen to him that you should never get any publicity whatsoever, no matter what you've done, no matter how proud you are of it. You should remain as concealed as possible, otherwise bad things will happen to you. And that attitude was not only passed down to his children, but to his grandchildren as well, and to the grandchildren of everybody involved in this case, even to the point where when I got around to finding them and trying to talk to them, they were very circumspect. And the only way I think that I got any kind of cooperation whatsoever from them was because of the same last name, and the fact that at some point we're probably related. Charles's granddaughter, who lives in Texas, I probably shouldn't tell you that, was especially helpful ultimately. And we enjoyed some good chats and emails together, and she shared with me most of the things that she had collected about the case. The other interesting thing about this particular case and J. Edgar Hoover was that while Hoover was maybe not the best lawman in the country at the time, he did understand public relations and publicity. And he was just beside himself with Hollywood, because Hollywood at the time was glamorizing gangsters, basically. In 1930, the #1 movie in the country was, in 1933, I'm sorry, was Scarface, starring James Cagney. Scarface is about a character based on Al Capone. Almost said Al Pacino. So Hoover knew that if he was going to be successful with his agents as a law enforcement agency, he was going to have to create them as heroes. He didn't want the gangsters to be the heroes anymore. He wanted his agents to be the heroes. And he personally went to James Cagney and complained and said, you ought to star in something that makes a hero out of a law enforcement officer. And basically, at the time, there was a big kind of public revulsion at these gangster movies that were growing increasingly violent, if you can believe that. And so Hollywood, fearing that there would be some kind of censorship imposed by the government, creates their own kind of rating system. And one of the things that they outlaw is gangster movies. They try to get the entire industry not to produce them. But Hoover manages to get one caveat put into the code, and that's that if you're going to make a gangster movie, you have to have an FBI agent in it. And if you're going to have an FBI agent in your movie, J. Edgar Hoover has got to approve the script. So in 1935, G-Men comes out with James Cagney as a FBI agent who solves a kidnapping. And there are 3 or 4 movies right after that with the same kind of scenario, with the same kind of FBI hero in it. Nevertheless, this Hoover did many more things, of course. I mean, he had his own publicists in-house. He had guys writing magazine stories about famous cases. He was just a master at manipulating the message. Unfortunately, George Kelly didn't have such a publicity department on his behalf. And the stories that Hoover put out about Kelly took hold. Basically, Hoover wanted to make Machine Gun Kelly into the worst kind of villain possible so that his achievement in catching him and prosecuting him would seem all the greater. And so he spread, and part of it is still in the FBI lore. It's on their website. You can read about it. One of the stories he spread was that when they finally cornered Machine Gun Kelly in Memphis, that he dropped his weapon and cowered in the corner and said, "Don't shoot, G-men, don't shoot." It didn't happen like that. If you want to know how it happens, you can read the book. But anyway, that then became the brand for the FBI. They're G-men, right? They are to this day. So as the years pass, the legend of Machine Gun Kelly continues to grow. And Roger Corman, who's the king of the B movie makers, decides to make a movie about him in 1958. He casts this unknown actor known as Charles Bronson in the lead and makes Machine Gun Kelly out to be a psychopathic machine gunner and kidnapper and just basically also living under the thumb of his domineering wife. So anyway, that's the image of Machine Gun Kelly that persists to this day. There are still songs written about him, movies made about him. James Taylor's got a song about Machine Gun Kelly, basically on that scenario. But the case really, in addition to all these other things that it spawned, it also proved the importance of branding and media manipulation. Hoover's reputation, of course, soared in the first 10 years he was in office, and then, as you probably know, began to sour as the years went on. But nevertheless, he did create the FBI as basically sort of the first national police force, and one of the most successful and modern at the time, and became the envy of the world. So I think I have droned on long enough, and if you would like to ask a question, since we are on C-SPAN, please come to the microphone and speak clearly into it. Yes, sir.
Two things. One, how much ransom did Urschel pay? And then the other question is, how did Machine Gun Kelly get his name, reputation? Did he actually kill anybody?
Okay. The ransom was, they took the ransom money out of the oil company's account. It was $200,000. And the second part of your question was, how did he get his reputation? Curiously, it was created by both J. Edgar Hoover and Catherine Kelly. George was a student of Harvey Bailey, and Harvey's credo was, you got to stay under the radar. It doesn't do you any good to go shooting up a bank. The police are going to come after you. You don't want to hurt anybody, because once you hurt somebody, that draws the law. So George was trying to prosecute his business in that fashion. In fact, he didn't like machine guns. He was kind of afraid of them. He liked to rob a bank with a concealed .38. He was, one of these charming, hail fellow, well-met Irishmen. He'd just go into the bank, incredibly well dressed. Both he and Catherine were clothes horses, very concerned about their image and their fashion statements. He'd walk in, he'd open his jacket, show the .38, and ask the ladies behind the counter to just empty their drawers into the satchel, and I'll be out of here with no problem. But Catherine that wasn't good enough for Catherine. Catherine wanted to be married to the most famous criminal in all of America. So she started working on his reputation. She buys him a machine gun at a pawn shop in Fort Worth, and then starts spreading stories about him at speakeasies all over Fort Worth and Dallas and Texas. And she was in plenty of them. She would leave spent shells behind and say that, we've been down to the farm and George has been working on his skills, and he can shoot walnuts off a fence post or write his name on the side of a barn with this gun, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it. And so the police officers down there who always kind of had their eye on Kelly and would hang around in these bars or speakeasies, they started picking up on all this stuff that they were hearing about him. And when they first started chasing him and they discovered that it was George Kelly, the police in Texas sent up this profile and said that he was a murderer and a expert machine gunner. And so that got on the wanted poster, and then that got into the press, and one thing led to another, and suddenly we have this psychopathic machine gun Kelly. But in fact, to finish your question, he's not known to have killed anybody. He did admit to shooting one guard, wounding him in the shoulder during a bank robbery, but that's about all. He did participate in a number of bank robberies where people did get shot and did get killed, but when they would form up these bank robbing gangs, they would pull different people for different skill sets, and they really didn't recruit Kelly in because of his viciousness or his skills with a weapon. They really liked him more for his skills behind the wheel. I mean, he had been a gin runner and a bootlegger for almost 20 years. He knew all the back roads. He loved cars. He had a 1932 18-cylinder Cadillac that he had customized by Al Capone's mechanic so that it could cruise at 100 miles an hour. You could never catch him once he was behind the wheel. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
This was before the mania over the Second Amendment. What were gun control laws like at this time? And could regular people get a machine gun?
Yes. I'm not an expert on weaponry or the laws about them, but I do believe that there were almost no laws preventing individuals from purchasing any kind of gun they wanted. In fact, the crime bill that this case spawned did include language that restricted automatic weapons like machine guns, specifically to get at the machine guns that were used in the Kansas City massacre at Union Station and the crimes that were reputedly committed by George Kelly.
Yes, actually, I think it was the following year, 1934 Firearms Act that outlawed submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns as a result of all this stuff that had been going on.
Right.
Yeah, one question and a comment. I understand that George Kelly, when he was in Alcatraz, was one of the few actual penitents in a penitentiary, that he wrote letters to Urschel and maybe some other people that he victimized, saying,
Yes.
Nothing could be worth this. I'm so sorry. I'll bear this guilt for the rest of my life. Is that true?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. He was a very literate man, and he wrote not only the letter you're referring to, which is considered to be one of the best descriptions of what life is like behind bars that's ever been penned. And that is in the book. If you'd like to purchase a copy and read the whole thing for yourself. But yeah, he was a constant letter writer, as are a lot of prisoners, but he was particularly well-versed. He was smart. He would refer to Greek mythology in some of his letters, and he wrote hundreds of letters to Catherine that are just, heart-rending love letters that, will almost bring you to tears, if not laughter. So yeah, it was true. And when he was incarcerated at Alcatraz, they had a prison psychologist who did an evaluation of all the prisoners, and he rated Kelly as extremely intelligent. Kelly enrolled in correspondence courses from University of Southern California and had a little competition going with Albert Bates, who was also in Alcatraz, as to who could do better. And he was a voracious reader and would do anything he could to sort of deal with the isolation of prison life.
And I'd like to beg your pardon, but I think it was Paul Muni starred in Scarface. James Cagney had been and played a very similar role, also based on Capone, in 1931 in The Public Enemy.
You're right.
But anyway,
You're
sorry,
right.
it's a great talk.
You
I
got
don't
me
mean to
there. You know
nitpick.
your film history.
Thank you.
There are a lot of twists and turns. It seems like a lot of the topics dealt with people who Howard Hughes knew. Do you have a Howard Hughes angle on any of this?
Howard Hughes didn't make it in, although I should look for one. Do you think there is one?
Well, I mean, who did he? Was any involved with making the movie Scarface? Howard Hughes.
That I don't know.
Yeah, and he knew Thomas Slick, and of course he knew Herbert Hoover, and he was involved with the Hollywood censorship. And yeah, he's a lot of in Texas and oil. He had to know Urschel.
Yeah.
So there must be some sort of.
Yeah, Urschel was he was an active Democrat, and he was looking for. He had sent emissaries to Washington to try to get FDR to bring, believe it or not, this is how much the oil business has changed, to bring some regulation to the oil business to help protect the wildcatters who were being driven out of business by the big oil companies back east who were driving the price so low that nobody could make any money. Anything else? Well, thank you all very much for coming.
And folks, just a reminder, there is a book sale one level up at the Archives bookstore, so we'll meet you up there in a couple minutes.
And I'll be happy to sign any copy with any kind of verbiage you would like.